Half a day. My name is Ron Haynes, and I am the managing attorney of the Elder Justice Center here in Sinahanya, Guam. And I want to talk to you today about landlord-tenant law, especially right now when rents are skyrocketing, and it's very important for you to know your rights as a tenant, and quite frankly, to know what you can do as a landlord and what you can't. And I will spend a little bit of time just going over things that landlords cannot do that sometimes they do in order to have a tenant evicted, for example. But let's go through the process in order, okay? For example, if you're getting ready to rent an apartment, what should you do? First of all, let me say that Guam has its own Landlord-Tenant Act. There is a law, and there are things you can do other than what's stated in the law, and some things you can't. But there is an act here on Guam that is controlling about what landlords can do and what the responsibilities of tenants are. But you can enter a rental agreement that deviates slightly. So let's just talk about it as if you're renting an apartment. What's the first thing you should do? Let's say you found an apartment that you're interested in. First thing you do is do a walkthrough. Most of you already know that and are comfortable with that. But I really recommend, especially now we all have phones, take pictures of the apartment as it is before you rent it. This protects you. If you see some damage, for example, take a picture. Make sure the landlord gets a copy and says, just letting you know, this is what the place looked like before we moved in. Because you don't want a landlord coming back later and saying, hey, there's this gouge in the tile and the floor in the kitchen, and that was there when you moved in. Do you have a record of that? Are you going to be able to show that? That's why you need to take the pictures. Also, make sure you turn on every faucet, flush every toilet. Make sure things are working properly before you move in. And in some cases, you may need to move in right away. Write it down for the landlord. This needs to be fixed. This needs to be adjusted. Turn on the stove. Is it working? If you have a gas stove, make sure the flame works. Make sure the oven part works as well. So you want to do these things before you agree to rent from this particular landlord. So what you're going to need, in addition to a lease, and what is a lease? A lease is simply a contract, what your obligations are, what the landlord's obligations are, how much are they going to charge you. It protects you as well as a landlord. So let's say the landlord is saying, I want $1,000 a month for rent. Well, that goes into the lease. And if the lease is for 1 year, the landlord cannot raise the price of rent in the middle of the lease. Now, at the end of the lease, he can. Sometimes at the end of a lease, you might go to a month-to-month tenancy. In other words, you can agree with the landlord, hey, I'm going to stay on another 3 or 4 months, and the landlord may accept the price you're currently paying. He may not. So that is something that you should think about. But let's say your lease is for 1 year, it's for $1,000 a month. A landlord can ask for a security deposit. And if your lease is for $1,000 a month, that security deposit would be for $1,000. It cannot go over the price of a monthly rental. So if you're renting it for $1,000, you cannot now insist on $2,000 of a security deposit. It is by the act, it is regulated at 1 month's rent as a maximum. Now, you can also charge a pet deposit, but that pet deposit has a maximum dollar amount of $500. So that's it as far as the security deposit goes. Now, what are the landlord's responsibilities? His responsibilities are to keep the apartment fit and habitable, to make sure essential services are provided. So by that, what I mean is if something happens and a water pipe breaks, he has an obligation to fix that. If a toilet stops working and it's no fault of your own, he has an obligation to fix that. Now, what does that mean? You need to let him know, because he doesn't have an obligation if he doesn't know something is broken. So you need to give him notice. I always recommend give notice in writing. In fact, many parts of the act require that. Give notice in writing. So what is a writing? Well, if you have a relationship with your landlord that you're regularly texting things back and forth, that's a writing, but you have to be able to keep that writing. So, you may want to provide it another way. Email is a writing, any kind of writing that you normally communicate with the landlord. You can't text them if you've never texted him before, and he may not even know who this text is coming from. But you need to provide a writing. They have the obligation to keep it fit and habitable. Ceilings falling in, no, they have to fix that. And you have to give them that notice in writing. Now, you cannot set out on your own to fix it. Let's say a part of the ceiling has fallen in. You can't say, well, I'm going to fix that and I'll deduct off of the rent the cost of fixing this. Under the Guam Act, you cannot do that unless you agree with the landlord in writing that that's what you're going to do. And in those cases, I absolutely recommend you get estimates. If you're going to have, your friend fix the ceiling, well, is he licensed? Is he bonded? And if he is, he still has to charge the fair market rate. Now, if you have somebody come in and fix it for $1,000 when anybody else would have fixed it for $200, you're not going to be able to deduct that off of your rent. That would be an unjustified expense. The best way for you to proceed is to get things in writing, give estimates to the landlord if he's agreeing that you can fix it. This will protect yourself, okay? There are obligations for tenants as well, of course, and the number one obligation is to pay rent. You have a window of 5 days called grace period. I don't recommend you make a habit of that. Always pay your rent on time. And your other obligations are to maintain the property in the condition you found it, in good condition, and to dispose of the garbage. But you also have a responsibility for the guests that come into your rented property. You're responsible for your guests. So if they destroy something, that's going to come back on you. It is not going to be the landlord's responsibility. Now, even in the middle of your lease, things can be adjusted if the landlord gives you notice, and these things are for safety. For example, something happens in the parking lot needs to be repaired, and you normally have a spot in the parking lot. Well, the landlord can provide you with notice that you'll need to park someplace else. These kind of things are reasonable. Now, let's talk about landlord inspections. Can the landlord come in anytime he wants to? The answer is no, but they can have reasonable inspection times. They can come into the apartment. They must give you notice, at least 24 hours notice. I would recommend, if you're a landlord and you're watching this, also put that in writing. Give 24 hours notice in writing, and tell the tenant why. Now, you can't do inspections every week. You can't use this as a way of harassing a tenant. Can a tenant object and say, no, you can't come in? Yes, a tenant can if that is reasonable. So if you're coming in every day, no, the tenant can say, no, you can't. It is not your premises. These are my premises that I am renting. You may own it, but you don't control what goes on inside. So, you know, you need to be reasonable on both sides. If a landlord comes in once a month and gives proper notice, that's not unusual. But beyond that, if it became habitual, I would begin to question what is going on there. What is the remedy for a tenant? The remedy of a landlord not doing what he's supposed to. We talked about essential services. Absolutely, landlords got to repair those as quickly as possible. What about other things that may occur? I don't know, something can occur. You've got 2 bathrooms and one of them is not working, or there needs to be a repair because the building is just, you know, buildings need repair sometimes. You need to give the landlord notice, and you can actually get out of your lease in this way if the landlord is not doing repairs that are necessary and not your fault. You would have to give them 30 days notice, and they would have 14 days to cure the problem. And I will tell you, if that happens, you might wind up with an argument. He might try to say that you have run out on your rent or something like that. You need to keep the proof. Take pictures, provide writing. Always try to protect yourself. As I said, a tenant cannot withhold rent, You pay your rent on time. Why would a tenant withhold rent? Let's say something happens at the upstairs neighbor, and it has hurt your wall, and you want it repaired. Again, give notice to the tenant. He has an obligation to repair it. If he doesn't, you can leave the apartment if it is material, if it is important, right? An upstairs neighbor had a flood, it destroyed this wall. He has an obligation to repair it. You cannot. Remember, that is not your remedy unless you and the landlord agree in writing. And there are cure periods as well. If the landlord is concerned with what you're doing, he needs to supply a letter to you. Let's say there's garbage. He inspects the apartment. There's garbage piled up in the kitchen. No, you have a duty to keep the place clean and damage-free. So he can give you notice in writing, and you have 5 days to cure that issue. If you can get it cured within 5 days, again, take pictures. Otherwise, you could be evicted within 30 days. Abandonment. This is something that I think is, you know, that the rule might seem a little odd, because if you leave the property for more than 7 days, it can be considered abandoned. So if you're going on vacation and you're going off island, very few of us go off island for less than 7 days. So you need to give notice to the landlord that you're going to, you know, you're paying the rent, you have no intention to abandon, and you're going to be off island for 2 or 3 weeks. You need to let them know. Otherwise, it can be considered abandoned. What happens if the property is abandoned? You leave it for a length of time, and the landlord comes in and retakes possession. He needs to hold your things, and he could put them up for reasonable sale. He could also put them in storage, of which you will be responsible if you want to get those things back. But he can't destroy your property. If he does, you can have a lawsuit against the landlord. Now, let's go back and talk about security deposits, because we talked about them coming into the apartment. What about when you're leaving? can the landlord keep your security deposit? And the answer is no, not in its entirety. Maybe that answer should be maybe, because let's say you've got that $1,000 security deposit. Within 14 days, the landlord needs to give you notice as to why he is keeping any part of the security deposit. And by any part, that means, a reasonable cleaning fee. If you are moving out, clean the place top to bottom, take pictures again of how you left the property. Ordinary wear and tear, a landlord cannot charge you for. So you move out after a year and he tries to replace the carpet, saying that you've worn out the carpet. You need to have pictures of that to show, no, the carpet was clean when I left. He just wants new carpet. So he cannot charge you for that, okay? Again, you want to take photos. If a landlord willfully, deliberately holds your security deposit without justifying why. There was a hole in the wall, cost me $100 to fix it. He doesn't justify those answers, and he deliberately refuses to give you your security deposit back. You can sue him for up to 3 times that damage. So let's say he keeps the whole 1,000, has no reason to do anything. Place was perfectly clean. Everything was returned as you first got it. You can sue him for up to $3,000. So there is a remedy for you. Now, I want to go back through a little bit, and I've typed this out of what landlords cannot do. And so let's take a look at this list. What landlords cannot do. They cannot use what's called self-help to evict you from your rented premises. A landlord cannot lock you out, cannot change the locks, cannot cut off essential services to make you move. They cannot threaten you with jail or abuse. They cannot have the police throw you out without first having gone through a court process of eviction. Other things they cannot do. They cannot enter your premises. We talked a little bit about this, without 24 hours notice, unless there is an emergency. They cannot raise your rent if you have a valid lease that limits that rent. And they cannot keep your security deposit when you move without giving you justifiable reasons. So those are just a little bit of landlord-tenant law. It is just a little overview, and that is to help you to keep your apartment. If you're moving out, always give 30 days notice. Do it in writing. Always prepare, always communicate. Do not be afraid of communicating with the landlord, and always do it in writing to protect yourself, okay? I hope this has helped you. If you need other information, you can certainly call our office, and I hope you don't have to, okay? And that you can keep your premises and live peacefully.